When making a ring, the first thing you have to do is figure out how big you want it to be. And there's a couple ways to do that. One, if you have a ring already that's the right size, this is a graduated ring mandrel. It has the sizes on it, so I can slide this on. And this tells me it's an 8 3/4. There's the 8, there's the 9. It's not quite onto the 9. So 8 1/2 would be about here, and 8 would be here. So this ring is about an 8 3/4. Another way to do it is this ring size right here. These have standard ring sizes on them, 9 1/2, 10 1/2, and you can just take this and slide it on and see which one fits. One thing with these is you don't want it to be too snug. Like this says 8 1/2, and that really is way too tight. So I definitely wouldn't want an 8 1/2. You want to be able to get it off and on fairly comfortably. So the other way to do it, and this is what you'll do for your practice ring, is you take a sheet of graph paper, and again, working from the edges, so there's no need to cut right from the middle and waste all the paper. You're going to cut a strip that's 2 blocks wide. And there's a reason for that dimension. 1 block is too thin to cut, and the wider your seam is, the harder it is to solder it. And so for a practice ring, having 2 blocks is a good size to start with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this around the finger that I want to make the ring for. And I'm not going to pull it super tight, I'm just going to rest it there. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to mark where that bottom piece and the top piece overlap. And when I do that, this is how much metal I need for my ring. So what I'm going to do now is I'll just cut this off right there. For your ring, you can use brass or new gold. Brass or copper, and you want it to be 20 gauge at the thinnest. 18 or 20 gauge would be fine. 20 gauge would probably be the best. And now this is a machined piece of metal. This is a finished edge. So I'm going to make my life easier. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tape my practice piece right down to the edge, and that'll save me from having to do a lot of extra cutting. Put the tape down, and now I'm going to cut this out. The saw and not the shears is if you cut this with one of the shears, as the shear cuts, it's actually pinching the metal, and what that does is it distorts it and it curves the metal, and so it no longer will be straight. The shears is great for cutting out blocks of metal, but it does not work well for cutting strips. Once you have the blank cut out, or the strip, the next step is to get the seams that you're going to solder together next to each other. So we don't want to make it round yet. That's the last thing we do. To make it easier to solder and to have a stronger seam, what you really want to do is you want to make an oval shape. So what I do is I rest my thumb on about the 1/3 mark, and I just wrap that end around. Then I'll do the same thing on the other side. Alright, and now you have a couple of choices. You can use the rawhide mallet to kind of start bringing these together, and that's maybe the easiest way to do it. Otherwise, if you have strong enough fingers, you can just do it by hand. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the rawhide mallet, and you can see now I'm trying to bring these 2 edges towards each other. But what's really important is if you think of these as the 2 ends of the metal, as I'm bringing them together, if I do this, I'm left with a V shape. And the solder won't fill that void. It'll only solder the metal together where it's touching. So when we solder, what we're actually doing is we're creating an alloy. We're molecularly combining the 2 pieces. So it's important that those 2 edges come together like this. The other thing is we don't want the metal doing this, and we don't want this. We want a nice tight seam all the way across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just trying to get it close, and then I'll tweak it to get it to look like this. And then the other thing is, metal has a memory. It typically wants to go back to where it was. So to keep this seam tight, what we're going to do is we're actually going to initially overlap the metal like this, and then we're going to pull it back apart then slide this down. And what that's going to do is it's going to apply pressure on the seam, because the metal is going to want to go back to here, but it won't be able to. So the things to remember is get this nice and straight and get tension on it. Don't solder it together like this. Some people will forget that last step, which is to pull the metal back apart. But if we look at this piece right now, we can see there's still a huge gap and the metal's not coming in straight towards each other. So I'm going to take the rawhide mallet, overlap it, and then pull it back apart. You can see there's a step right there. And we're going to want to get these two sides flush. And you'll notice I'm always working on the bench pin. We don't work on the tabletops. If we wreck this, if we drill into this, if we break this, it's no big deal. We just make a new one. So get used to working on your bench pin. You'll notice there's a step right here and a step right here. They don't line up perfectly. If I leave it like this, I've got to fix both of those. So typically what I like to do is I like to pick one side and have that one line up, and then if I need to, I'll fix this one side, as opposed to having two sides to fix. Now there's one last thing. It's pretty hard to see, but right now this side is raised up higher than this side. The two pieces aren't perfectly straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of my pliers, and in this case I'm going to use the box nose pliers where it's got a square tip, and I'm going to grab one side and I'm just going to twist it a little bit. And we're getting awfully close here. So we're doing pretty well. We got the tops lined up. Do it carefully though, it's still not straight across. So I'm going to take my rawhide mallet, I'm just going to take those down a little bit further. And now what I want to do is I want to check the seam. So the best way to do that to make sure it's tight is I'm going to hold it up to the light. To fix that gap in the seam, the best way to do that is you take a blue table vise or any table vise, and for these you have to crank it down all the way in order to fit it over the edge. But again, you want to fit it on that steel plate. You don't want this screwing into the bottom side of the wood table. And clamp the ring sideways. You don't want to clamp it this way because that puts too much pressure on it and you'll break your blade. So I'm just going to take it and tighten it down like this. You do want to get the seam fairly close to the vise. If you had the seam way out here, as you cut, it moves it around a lot. So if you can support that seam fairly close to the vise, that works pretty well. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my saw and I'm going to cut through that seam. So what I'll do is I'll start on the side where the gap was the widest and I'll cut towards where the metal was touching. And one thing to be careful of is a lot of people will cut at too steep of an angle and you actually end up cutting through the bottom of your ring. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply a little bit of pressure this way and I'm going to hold the ring steady, and I'll start with the blade. Sometimes you have to slide it this way first to get it started. And you want to cut right through the seam, and what the saw is doing is the saw is working like a file, and it's going to file off the high points, and it's going to create two symmetrical or mirror image edges so they'll fit together perfectly. Sometimes you have to do this 2 or 3 times, depending on how bad your cut is or how bad that gap is. So then I'll just pull that apart, get the blade out, and I can see right now, just from this angle, that's a perfect seam. Overlap it again and pull it back apart just to make sure it has that added pressure pushing the seam towards each other.